Okay, I want to say welcome everyone to Measuring Progress, online forum on well-being. Just as a reminder, we're recording today's event, which we will make available online for future reference. Thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate having this large group of people joining from various different organizations. For those of you who did not attend our first seminar, I am Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers at StatTech Research, which is part of Luxembourg's Institute for Statistics and Economic Studies. For those of you who did attend, welcome back. We're happy to have you. I'd also like to thank today the International Society for Quality of Life Studies for support in advertising these talks. Today we have Professors Andrew Oswald and Carol Graham. They're going to continue our series of talks. First we'll have Professor Oswald, and then he will be followed by Professor Graham. Tomorrow we will have Professor Ruud Veenhoven and author John McGrath joining us. The recording of each talk will be added to our website, and so far the one for Professors Stefano Barzolini and Richard Easton's talk has already been sent to the mailing list, and we will add them to the website fairly soon. We're going to get started right away today, but before I introduce Professor Oswald, just a couple more organizational items. So we want to facilitate as many questions as possible. So we ask that you please post your questions in the Q&A box. My colleague Francesco and I will then read out the questions for our speakers to respond. We're also going to have them on the shared screen. And please keep your microphones muted to make it easier for everyone to hear. Now to welcome Professor Oswald. So Professor, you can, we'll let you share your screen. Francesco, if you want to, you can stop sharing and we'll let Professor Oswald share his.
Ah, sorry.
Okay.
I thought I was already canceled.
Yeah, and so Professor, while I introduce you, you can get started. So Andrew Oswald is a professor of economics and behavioral science at the University of Warwick. So his research is principally in applied economics and quantitative social science. Currently his work includes research on COVID-19 crisis and health economics. But you'll likely better know him as one of the pioneers of happiness economics. Indeed, he has multiple papers that are among the most cited in the happiness economics literature. Though I should note this applies more generally to economics. He's ranked by the Institute for Scientific Information as a highly cited researcher. More generally, his accolades are numerous and his work prolific and interesting. It's also not just for academics, so I encourage everyone to check it out. Without further ado, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's true, of course, that I've done a lot of work on what might be called the economics or social science of happiness. But today I'm going to go back to what you might view, if you did economics a long time ago, of the roots of economics, where it used to be called the dismal science. And I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be dismal for quite a bit of today. I'm going to show you data on extreme distress. However, for anybody who knows that the Euro Football Championships is going on at the moment, and who might have an idea about who England will face tomorrow night, I should emphasize there's one kind of extreme distress that I'm not going to discuss, and I'm hoping won't actually occur tomorrow night. Of course, extreme distress is terribly important. I hope we might all recognize in society. We would like everybody to have happy and fulfilled lives, but perhaps as policymakers or social scientists, those right at the bottom end, one might say, of the distribution of psychological well-being are perhaps particularly important, particularly worthy of scientific and policy attention. And I'm going to go through patterns in three kinds of dismal data, but then we'll try and at the end and review and think what good things might come out of this. I'm going to show you a lot of data on pain, physical pain. Obviously, this is one of the most important sensations that humans have in the negative sphere of their life. And indeed, in the data I'll show you, about 1/4 of everybody in a huge random sample says, I was in a lot of pain yesterday. We'll also go through data on what you might call extreme extremely poor, extreme levels of mental distress, not just unhappiness in an everyday sense. We all have ups and downs in our lives, but we'll focus on the really mentally stressed end. And then finally, I'm afraid getting even worse, we'll look at suicide ideation, thinking about taking your own life, and a lot of other extreme distress measures. There are three scientific puzzles here for any kind of economist or health researcher or policy maker. I think of these as both important and very possibly timeless, or at least timeless within the modern era. I can't tell you what causes all of these, but we're going to try to understand them. And here's the first scientific puzzle. This is joint work with Lucia Macchia, who's a young researcher at the Kennedy School in Cambridge, Mass. We take data on about 1 million people, and we look at the answers to this rather simple but I think interesting question. 1 million randomly sampled people in the world. Did you experience the following feeling a lot of the day yesterday? Physical pain, yes or no? Were you in a lot of pain, you might say, a lot of the day yesterday? And I think remarkably, about a quarter, as I implied, just over a quarter of people say, yes, I was in a lot of pain. That sounds like a major issue to me as a potential policy maker. I'm going to start with some scatter plots. I know there are many different kinds of people watching this. We'll look at some scatter plots, some simple graphs, and then for those who are more specialist, I will show one or two equations, although I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time on technical things. Mostly today it will be graphs and ideas. This takes information on the OECD countries, you know, what we might call the rich countries of the world. And we're plotting the change in the unemployment rate along the horizontal axis against the change in reported levels of physical pain using the information I've just gone through, the proportion of people in a country who say, I was in a lot of pain yesterday, loosely speaking. You can see there's a positive correlation. As unemployment rises in Luxembourg or Britain or Belgium or Chile, as unemployment rises, more and more people say, I'm in a lot of physical pain. Now, on the surface, that's against what we might expect. Why is that? Because it's in a boom when people work longer hours, they have more accidents on the road, they're rushing more, they work under more stress, and so on. Now, this is going to the richest 73 countries in our data set. I should explain that Lucia and I have randomly sampled people from 146 nations. And here again, you can see, ladies and gentlemen, if you run your eye along the horizontal axis, that's the change in the unemployment rate, country by country. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we see the change in physical pain. And again, a recession, a rise in unemployment goes with people experiencing more physical pain. And finally, this is the full size.
Andrew, can I interrupt your talk? So according to Chris Roof's QJ paper, you know, very famous paper showing that people get healthier during the recession, isn't this paper a bit the opposite of what he established? Well, and I just want to hear your opinion about the existing paper and this finding.
Well, nice to see you, Sian Mahun. I suspect you're meant to keep your questions to the end, but I'll just go very happily with the flow as you're one of my co-authors and friends. Well, we aren't comparing exactly the same thing. Of course, the result by Room, Chris Room, is a famous one, but here we're looking at pain per se. We're not looking at health. And the other thing to say is, this is the data, don't blame me, blame the data. In our technical report, of course, Lucia and I do talk about the Room work, but I'm not going to say anything more about it today, if that's all right. Kelsey will keep me right if I should take more questions as I go along. I don't mind either way. Very nice to see you, Sian.
I think sorry, yeah, Andrew, I was just going to respond. Sorry to interrupt the flow. I think, yeah, we'll keep the questions to the end. And you can write them in the chat immediately, though. That way we can you don't forget your question, and we'll get to it at the end.
Let me. I've shown you the spirit of the idea that in a recession, people are reporting actually a lot more pain in a perplexing way, I think. If for the specialists here, if we look at what are called country panel equations, these take out country fixed effects and so on. For the specialists in the audience, if they run their eye along the top row next to the unemployment rate, we see the unemployment rate coming in statistically significantly in what you might call a country level. I know it's a strange idea, a country level physical pain equation. So this is adjusting for many other characteristics, all the things that we know about people, including their income, their employment status, their gender, their marital status, and so on, that in a way that goes beyond statistically what we looked at in the simple scatters. But we get the same, I think, interesting conclusion. So this is a natural business cycle indicator. As the unemployment rate rises, physical pain actually goes up. Now we can go through all sorts of subsamples. Here I have men in the first column, I have women in the second column, and so on. And to our surprise, this unpleasant effect in a slump is found really only for women, or almost completely for females. So for anyone interested in this listening, perhaps particularly if you are female yourself, in a recession, there's a lot more physical pain felt by the citizens of a country, but that is almost exclusively among the females in that country. And we're not sure why. Just a reminder here, we've controlled in these equations for personal unemployment. In other words, there's some enormous spillover effect going on here. If I become unemployed, it's true that I suffer more physical pain, maybe because I'm, you might say, tortured mentally inside. I've lost my job. But what we show in our paper in these regression equations is that that is very generally true. Even those who don't lose their jobs in a recession feel a considerably more physical pain. I don't know how to explain that, but I greatly recommend this article by Chu et al., Eileen Chu and her colleagues in the United States, which does a whole bunch of what you might call very interesting but small-scale experiments. I'd like to think that my work with Lucia is complementary to this. Chu's paper goes before us and comes up with the interesting idea that economic insecurity creates pain in my body, and you might say in my mind. When I become economically insecure, I feel more physical pain. Now, how that happens, ladies and gentlemen, we don't know, but perhaps it's because stress makes me tense. Tense gives me aches. Perhaps if I'm tense, I tear muscles more and so on. Nobody knows. But I do think that perhaps in the future, governments could go not just to measure gross domestic product, not just to measure people's average happiness even, which the UK has started to do, but might even want to collect data on feelings of physical pain. Let me go on to scientific puzzle number 2 out of the 3 I want to take you through. And all of these numbers will come from the United States, but as probably all Western Europeans know, we tend to follow the United States for good or ill. Not quite Trump, but for good or ill, we tend to follow the United States with a lag of about 10 years or sometimes more. Blanchflower and I pooled up, that is, combined all the years of what's called the BRFSS data set. That gives us about 8 million Americans randomly sampled. And we're interested in the question, is life getting worse in the United States? Is life getting worse in the United States? And if so, among whom? Here's the question that we used. We have nearly 3 decades of people, random samples of Americans answering this question, 8 million in total. thinking about your mental health, which includes stress, depression, and problems with emotions. You might like to think how you would answer this, ladies and gentlemen. How many days during the past 30 was your mental health not good? So how many days during the past 30 was your mental health not good? And we're going to define extreme mental distress as people who say every day of the last month, I had bad mental health. We're going to go right to the extreme. Every day of my life is a bad day, you might say, speaking loosely. Remarkably, the proportion of Americans like that has increased dramatically since 1993. I'm hoping you can see on the bottom of your screen on the horizontal axis. On mine, it runs from 1993 to 2019. This is the proportion of people saying every day in the last month, I had bad mental health. And you see it rises from about 4% for females, about 3% and a bit for males in the early 90s. I remember going to Princeton. I would spend a year in Princeton in 1983 and got chatting to my postman one day. I was a very young economist, and he told me that that weekend he was going off to his summer house. And I thought, wow, in this country, even a postman has a summer house. This must be a rich country. At that time, I wasn't living on much income. I suspect that little parable lies behind here somehow. But anyway, we see this near doubling of extreme despair, you might say, in the United States of America. And I'll show you briefly, if I may, the subgroups, which turn out to be, I think, particularly important. So there's a bunch of lines on here, and I'm going to take my time. I'd like you to look at what is a light blue line to me. This is the proportion of people who, roughly speaking, are middle-aged, who report extreme distress. Every day of my life is a bad day. And if you look at the light blue line, we see this is the proportion of whites with no college degree. That was my postman in Princeton in the 1980s, I reckon. That goes from fewer than 5% of Americans to getting on for 12%. I suspect this is why Mr. Trump got elected, or at least has something to do with that. If you look at who are the most privileged, whites with some college would be the most privileged, like the students I've taught in various times working in the USA. They have had a very slight rise. That's the green line on my diagram, a slight rise in extreme distress. 1993 was what, would you say, about 3.5% of those? And by 2019, a little bit under 5%. But those who are white with what we might call low education, that's been a dramatic shift. Bloodflower and I estimate technical regression equations that I will not put up, as this is intended for a wider audience, not just statistical specialists. And I think consistent with common sense, what we're finding there in the USA, this goes along with a lot of the rhetoric that one heard from Mr. Trump and his supporters, which was tied in, I think it would be fair to say, to views about the labor market, about how American workers were being denied by overseas workers, or whatever the detailed story. We find statistically very strong predictors are those unable to work, those who report being unemployed. And if we look at the state characteristics, with 8 million workers, of course, we have a lot of workers randomly sampled in every state from Texas to New Hampshire. States where there's a fast decline in manufacturing jobs were the ones where the highest level of extreme distress was reported. Our paper came out fairly recently in the American Journal of Public Health, and to the best of our knowledge, that trend is continuing strongly today and may have Donald Trump re-elected. In our continent, it's quite possible that we're going to see the same trends, I'm afraid, if history repeats itself in giant social science trends. So it's best for us to be forewarned, I think, about this. Let me close with scientific puzzle number 3. Again, I'm going to show you a lot of graphs. And I'm still, I'm afraid, sticking to economics being the dismal science, or at least behavioral science and economics combined. We're going to look at human distress through life. As I get older and older, what happens to me? Of course, there's a whole list of feelings, different measures of happiness and unhappiness. And you'll see that I want to concentrate on the really quite unpleasant end, I'm afraid. I want to emphasize this is a big joint project with 5 talented co-authors who probably deserve more credit than I do, from Pittsburgh, London, Warwick, and Nuffield College in Oxford. I won't describe everyone in detail. Let me start, though, by setting the scene on what's already known. Kelsey will know this well. Most life satisfaction happiness researchers in this meeting will be aware there's at least a great deal of evidence. There continues to be some dispute about it, but some great deal of evidence that life satisfaction in our kinds of countries seems to follow a U-shape through life once we control for other things. So this is from the United Kingdom. If you look at the pale blue line, I hope you can see it on your screen. This is a rough U-shape, which minimizes, I suppose, around the age of 52. And this is so-called without controls. In other words, this is just a raw plot. It's just taking the data. There's no fancy statistics. We're just putting up the numbers on a graph. The red line, which is not terribly different, controls for marital status and income and all kinds of stuff. Closer to home, this is for the European nations, 36 of them. I'm afraid I can't remember whether Luxembourg is in there, but very possibly. This is a smaller sample, so it's not so smooth, but we see roughly the same pattern. It's not understood why this shape is visible in the data so often. And if you want the equivalent for the United States, Stone and Deaton and others published this in one of the scientific journals. This is a different measure, but again, I'd like you to see, if I may, that there's age on the horizontal axis. And there's a kind of U shape or V shape for what's described as WB ladder, which doesn't help a lot, but it's a simple measure of how much people are enjoying their lives. Now, my colleagues Giantella et al. Wanted to go to much more extreme measures and to think about the hypothesis of a midlife crisis, not just where there's a sort of low point, but really to a crisis. If we go to the English-speaking nations, we find this rather perplexing and unhappy plot, where we see that the suicide rate in my kind of country, all over the world, America, New Zealand, and so on, the suicide risk peaks in the late 40s. If we adjust for so-called cohort effects, that is, maybe babies are born differently. They have different characteristics depending on the decade they're born in. Maybe the air was more polluted and somehow they're more violent to themselves, but correcting for that makes no difference. We find this hump shape in suicide risk over and over in non-English speaking countries as well. I did give this talk somewhat recently in Denmark, and you can see this is just a plot. It's one of the happiest countries in the world. But again, it has a midlife peak in people, I'm afraid, killing themselves. I've also given this talk somewhat recently on Australia. And although Australians, perhaps because they have guns more readily than in most countries, I'm afraid, like the US, although they have a spike in suicide right at the end of life, I'm afraid people, particularly men who are suffering, take their own lives with revolvers and so on. But again, in midlife, we see this, I think, remarkable peak. It's worth remembering those aged, say, 49 in our kinds of countries essentially have no ill health. They're at the peak of their earnings and their lives in some sense are very stable. If we look at sleeping problems, we see the same kind of pattern. There's a U-shape in sleep hours all over the Western world. People have the biggest trouble sleeping in midlife. And if you remember your Macbeth, Sleep is a marker. You remember Lady Macbeth? Sleep's a marker of mental distress. I used to be able to quote Macbeth, but perhaps I won't try just without checking. It's the same U shape is found in many, many countries by age. In our paper, then we switched to British data on random samples asked, is your life worth living? And very sadly, people in midlife disproportionately say, my life is not worth living. Again, in Britain, remember, this is one of the richest countries in the world and in history. One of the safest countries in the world. And these people are close to their peak earnings. They report serious, this is really severe concentration problems, ladies and gentlemen. Dependence on alcohol. Thinking about suicide. Again, there's a hump shape in midlife. How about work stress? Australia has very, very good longitudinal data on work and randomly sampled workers. As part of the paper, we took a bunch of questions like, I think the amount of stress in my job is going to make me physically ill. My job is more stressful than I'd ever imagined, and so on. We average these in a way that I won't describe. Then we plot them longitudinally, following people literally as they age, following them literally as they age. This is not cross-sectional. And once again, we see they're reporting extreme levels of what you might call distress in employment, distress in the workplace, in midlife. Do you get headaches? This is data, this is information on disabling headaches in British data. There's a fascinating literature for anyone who hasn't dipped into it on migraine as a stress response. I have a number of close people who, when they're under extreme distress, can have these blinding migraines where they have to go to bed for half a day. Some of you may have experienced this. Without going into the details, this is a longitudinal estimate of the life cycle of severe migraine, severe disabling headaches. And once again, we see an unexplained midlife peak. Again, I should stress, this is following people as they age. This is not a cross-sectional plot. I'm going to start to draw to a conclusion. I'm going to take lots more questions like Seong Hoon's very good one. We've gone through 3 scientific puzzles. I would dearly like to see them solved in my lifetime, but if necessary, somebody younger in this meeting is going to have to solve them. They seem relevant to economists, especially health economists, but not just health economists, all kinds of behavioral scientists, medical statisticians, epidemiologists, public health researchers, and I think policymakers. If you're a policymaker and you don't follow the academic literature closely, who can blame you? Then if there's one thing I would like you to remember, or if you might be willing to take it away from this talk, one thing if you would take away from this talk is, in Western society, we have an unexplained crisis among middle-aged people. They kill themselves more, they can't sleep properly, they have severe headaches, they show a whole range of distress symptoms. Yet we live in the safest, richest societies that have ever existed. This is, I think, a fundamental problem for policymakers, and most policymakers, certainly in my country, are not aware of it. What explains these phenomena? Physical pain rises in a recession, almost completely among women, not men. Suicide and other really extreme distress measures peak in midlife, yet that's when people are richest. No economist would predict that. And finally, think of underlying trends, and we must hope that our continent does not go through this, because it's proved extremely dangerous, I would say, for the United States of America. And that underlying trend in extreme distress, particularly among what you might call low qualified people, those with less education than a bunch of us on this meeting, that underlying trend shows no sign of slowing down. And I have to confess, I am worried about it, ladies and gentlemen. We must hope that the continent of Europe doesn't see some equivalent. Thank you very much indeed for tuning in. I'm sorry to be on the dismal end of life, but I'm delighted to take general points or questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Although dismal, it's very helpful to see these, as you mentioned, important points, especially as you said, policymakers are often unaware. So far, participants haven't added much to the chat, so I invite people to do so now. And I can start us off with a question, perhaps. This is actually a paper I discovered with Carol, so she has some overlapping work, as you know, about perhaps individuals are mispredicting. So they are trying to achieve certain events in midlife. They achieve them, think they're going to bring them much more happiness. So they're making a lot of investment with the idea that it's going to pay off. They find the payoff doesn't prove to be as strong as they thought. And then we readjust their expectations as we age. Do you think there's something to this theory?
I do think there's something to that theory. And many researchers and members of the public, if I give public lectures, do have the second bit as a kind of response that we somehow, we face up to stuff in midlife and then we can somehow acclimatize to it or acclimate to it, an American might say. But the question is, why are we so disappointed, you might say, or why are our forecasts, that's what's going on, why are our forecasts so unrealistic and inaccurate? Tons and tons of good things are happening in midlife. Even if I am deeply disappointed that I did not captain the England soccer team to beat Germany at Wembley, even if I'm deeply disappointed not to have won the Nobel Prize in Economics and lots of other stuff, I still have a really good life at the age of 50 in almost all modern society. And therefore, it's just a paradox. We see such an extreme response, I think.
Yes. Okay, so just to reiterate, there's a lot of good things happening too. And so it's still unclear. I see we now have questions coming into the chat. So if you don't mind, you can stop sharing your slide. And what we're going to do is share the questions that we have.
Great.
Showing up from the chat.
Yes.
Thank you. And let's see. So just give us 1 second.
Sure.
Francesco.
I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon. Our first question is from Miguel Cruz Vasquez, who asks, do you think these problems are similar in developing countries? And there is a related one by Paul Thomas, who asks, what can we say about midlife crisis in countries like India and China, where the proportion of young generation is high and will be soon approaching their midlives? Is there a need for policy intervention required in these countries so that they don't experience the same situation as developed countries?
Okay, so there are at least two bits to that. Let me just take the second part first. At the moment, we don't know how to do an intervention to stop this extreme midlife low or extreme high in mental distress. Nobody knows how to do that, not even in the rich countries. But going back to the first part, which is a very important scientific issue, there is, yes, a great deal of evidence that this U shape in well-being or hill shape in distress is found in many, many developing countries, the less rich countries. It would be true to say that we can't check on really good quality suicide data and some of the other measures I've used. It would also be important to explain to everyone that much remains to be discovered about the details of this. There is still some dispute about these kinds of patterns. But yes, the balance of the evidence, I think, is that such patterns exist in the less rich part of the world as well.
All right, so now we have a question. I think it's from Christian Krekel. So what about your own mortality becoming salient for the first time during midlife? It's when you first start thinking about it. Perhaps it's when your parents die, or maybe you lose your friends. And as you grow older, you come to grips with it. When you are younger, death is only an abstract concept.
For a second, I thought Chris Krekel was asking me about how I felt about my likely mortality. As you know, he's much younger than I am, you see. Well, we don't know. It's an interesting theory. Of course, Jakes in about 40 years ago or so, 50 years ago, suggested something like that we get, if you're a golfer, think of, you play a round of 18 holes. When you get halfway around to the 9th tee, then you're about to turn back and you think, hey, wait a minute, I'm on the back 9 here. This isn't looking so good. But this is just a theory. And one way to test it, if literally we think that death is becoming more salient in the middle of life, one way to test that would be to try to show that in places where the lifespan is longer, the minimum point comes more slowly, you might say. Anyway, it's an interesting idea. It does have the ring of plausibility about it. One difficulty I haven't mentioned is that I have a hand in a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showing that there's a U shape in well-being among great apes, among chimpanzees and orangutans. And it's not easy, unless there's something wrong with that paper, it's not easy to know how to square that with theories about knowing that you've got to half your lifespan point and so on. But much remains to be found out.
We have a question by Joyce. Can you hear me, Andrew?
I can.
Super. We have a question by Joyce who asks a little bit about the heterogeneity of the effect. In particular, he asks whether, do you know if people with children have more or less problems in midlife? I guess it's or less problems in midlife.
Yes, whenever I give a talk about this, of course, very sensibly, people ask about children. Are children stressing us? You might say, when we're in our late 40s and so on. But it turns out that the childless seem to have much the same patterns. And the bulk of what you might call the happiness literature doesn't actually find strong statistically significant effects from children. So I don't think having children or not having children can be an important part of this midlife puzzle. It does seem natural, though. Another possibility you might think is that because women go through menopause around roughly that time, or start to, that could have something to do with it as well. But the patterns seem very similar for men and women, so it's hard to think that kind of hormonal explanation is going to help explain this.
Very interesting. I'm glad we have a lot of questions coming in. So here's the next question. So considering the spread over time, can there not be other parameters creating a bias? For example, have the notions of the concepts not evolved over time? Thinking about how people are answering the questions. Has the relative extent of the scale not evolved over time? Has the focus on certain type of pain not changed over time? For example, if you have a lot of physical goods, you may start to focus on emotional needs and how they are not being fulfilled, or attribute more weight to emotional needs over, say, physical needs previously.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think. And it raises extremely difficult questions, of course, for any kind of researcher. We want to listen to people's feelings because feelings are all that matter, really. And yet we only know how to measure feelings by listening to words. And it is possible, as this shrewd commentator suggests, that the way humans use words might change a bit. And that is a potential problem. It's not going to explain all of these patterns. Just thinking of the midlife point, for example, we see the pattern in suicide and so on, in really objective things that are nothing to do with words. And although, say we look at the evidence for the United States through time, where reported distress is going up, although it's possible that people use words in different ways, it would be I think it would be a remarkable thing if in only 3 decades we'd seen a doubling of how easily they use the words, every day of my life was a day of bad mental health. It is possible, but that sounds like a stretch to me. So the general point is a very good one, and it's a difficult criticism. We need to bear it in mind as researchers. However, it's not going to explain all these patterns, and I think of it as it's a kind of weak thing to lean on as an explanation, but still very important to consider.
We're currently receiving really a lot of questions. I don't know if we managed to go through all of them. So I will just go on with the next one, and I think Kelsey is keeping the time, so he will interrupt us. Neha Kumari, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, asked, relative income or comparison with others is one of the predictor of distress. How can we reduce the things which are natural or biological? What intervention by economists is required in this regard?
Yep, I don't have a simple answer to this. I'm going to try to keep my answers shorter if there are many questions, by the way. I hope nobody will be offended. We don't know what kind of intervention to use. I have favoured in the past, and would still favour, heavily reducing advertising in Western society of what you might call positional goods like cars and so on. These mainly make me feel better by making other people feel worse. So I might think of interventions along the lines of advertising, but it's a big topic.
All right, so similar question. This is from Chiara Peroni with our research division. What is your view on a public policy debate that is often focused on the stress experienced by young people, especially in light of the pandemic? Do you think that the evidence you presented points towards the need for shifting that view?
I have written in Britain and been on the television and so on here talking about the terribly bad things that have happened to young people. We know that the mental health of young British citizens has taken a much bigger hit. And this is probably true all over the world, but young Britons have taken a much bigger psychological hit during the pandemic. And I think that my generation has treated them badly. In the last year, by the way, the U shape in happiness or hill shape in distress has disappeared. But of course, that's just a very special. It's been a very special year because the young and the old have been treated asymmetrically. But I think in the next year or two in Western society, we need to think harder about how to help the young. The old have been treated too well, and the young have been treated too badly.
Tatiana Karabchuk asks, another question that goes along the line of finding out the explanation for this dip in midlife. She says that life cycle researchers explained why the middle-aged are facing more stress, like providing for children education, providing for good and enough housing, etc. She asks, are you happy with their explanations?
No, I'm not happy with the explanations. I think that the U shape or hill shape, depending on how we think of it, is unexplained. And if the paper in PNAS on the life cycle of well-being in chimpanzees and orangutans is correct, then the explanation may ultimately be biological. We don't know.
Okay, question from Miguel Cruz Vasquez. What do you see as the effect of insecurity, violence, and other non-economic factors on people's anguish and pain? Is this similar to the effects of the economy?
Yes, since I started looking at what we might call well-being data, that was in the early 1990s, the data have always signaled that fear in a whole range of domains is a huge negative in human well-being. Maybe we don't need equations to know that, but our equations can tell you the size of the effect, and yeah, all kinds of fear. Of course, well-being in time of war falls tremendously, and so on. So yes, it's similar to, I'm just reading the question, it is similar to the effects of the economy, but we don't know the different mechanisms. In a way, it's more perplexing about a recession in which I'm not losing my job.
Thank you, Andrew. Here is a question by our next speaker, Carol Graham, who, as you know, has also something to say on this topic of despair. And here is her point. Carol, forgive me if I read it in your place. Given that increases in despair are greater among the less than college educated, and they experience a much greater midlife dip, perhaps deindustrialization and losing purpose/meaning in life job has something to do with it. Hard to have that only halfway through your life. And then she adds, accepting, of course, that the midlife dip seems to hit everyone.
Well, you know, I do think it seems a fundamental, you might even call it trait or characteristic, a really widespread one. But I certainly agree, if I'm understanding the question, that especially in the United States, it's those with who are the least advantaged in terms of education and income who've had the strongest upward trend in extreme distress.
I think that's going to be true, though, in the UK as well. I think it has a lot to do with the sort of decline of the working class. It's that weren't necessarily deprived, but had decent, respected jobs, and now they don't, and they're not trained for the next. They're just not trained for the way the next stage of economic growth is going to go. I think it's also an identity. It's sort of a whole, life experience thing that the wealthy don't have the same way, or the well-educated don't have the same way. And anyway, so I think we agree. It's just the extremes of despair in the midlife and suicides and everything else are really occurring in these groups. There's some evidence that in Scotland and possibly the UK, a couple of other countries as well.
Well, you and I do think similarly, Carol, about much of this, as we know, but rich people also, I'm afraid, take their lives in midlife. So I view it as a real scientific puzzle, as a general phenomenon.
Right, I have to say, unfortunately, we missed a couple of the Q&A in the Q&A box itself, which is, of course, what we said to use, but we're adding them now, and we'll do our best to get everything. Andrew, if you don't mind, we still have 10 minutes left. If you don't mind taking a few additional questions, we've got them here. So I will continue. Just let me know though if it feels like too much, and we can always get to them at some point later. So next question. So there's a suicide peak at midlife in the richest countries, and it seems that Luxembourg is not the case in Luxembourg. Do you have any explanation for any reason why that may not be the case in Luxembourg?
I did look up Luxembourg online, and it looked the same, but there are so few suicides that one would need a lot of years, I think, and to average across them. Plus, also, we know there are cohort effects in suicide in different countries, so we need to look across a large data set to see the underlying patterns.
All right, here is a question by Giovanni Burro. What is the channel you imagine for the link between unemployment and pain?
Yeah.
I can think about some mechanical explanation. Jobless people have access to worse medical care, or some psychological explanation. Sadness and despair lead to pain. The second channel should be known in the medical literature if it exists.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by the medical literature, but as I said, I'm very impressed by that paper in Psychological Science by Eileen Chu et al. And I do think, of course, I'm not sure, but I do think that it's probably working through the mind. When I'm worried, then I become more tense. There are all kinds of hormonal and stress responses in my body, and it seems to me rather plausible that I might feel more physical pain then. We know there are profound connections between the mind and the body. But no, I don't think that this mechanism is properly understood or has been proven, unless we count the Chu et al. Paper.
From Melinda Joxie, another colleague here at StatTech. So more job security and childcare could be two of the explanations why females may report more stress and thus more physical pain than males. Do you have any stats for working and non-working women?
Not offhand, I don't. We could check that, I must admit, and maybe Lucia has done that, and it's gone out of my mind. But that seems an excellent point. Yeah, I do think that the fact that it's the females, I think, sadly, who are taking almost the entire rise in pain in a recession. I do think that's an important research topic, and researchers need to get to the bottom of it.
I am sorry, but I'm really struggling keeping pace with the many questions that are flocking in. So Seong-gun Kim has asked actually 3 questions. Let me see if I managed to put them together. Bear with me just a second.
Okay.
So he's asking if you have considered Asian countries when studying the U-shaped pattern. Then is
the answer is yes to the answer is yes to that. There is some evidence in Asian countries.
Awesome. Second point is to strengthen the causal interpretation is wondering whether you have considered comparing physical pain right before and after the social security or food stamp disbursement dates, which happens on the 1st or 5th of the month.
Yeah. Let me just add a little bit of background. So there is a general political economy paper showing that people become more rational right after the payday. I kind of think that your finding potentially can provide kind of mechanism through which why a payday can make people make a more rational decision. They feel less pain, so they can make a better choice. So I'm wondering whether you can do the same kind of research design to better establish the causal chain, because
we
this kind of
need,
right people right after difference can give you some,
We certainly need research of that general kind to get to the true causal mechanisms. And I could talk about this a lot, but I better not.
So I think we'll just do the last two questions, and then we will proceed to Carol Graham's presentation. See if I have them here. All right. Can you unmute? Or mute, please. All right. Do you find some cases of inconsistent evidence by using data on extreme stress versus happiness?
I suppose there are bound to be some inconsistencies. That's the life of a researcher. It was Einstein, I think, who said, if we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't call it research, would we? Some of the patterns I've given you today are disputed. They're certainly not disputed by the majority of researchers, but yeah, they're, by definition, when you're pushing up against the frontier, there's going to be some arguing, and there's going to be some inconsistency. We certainly need more better data on developing countries. A lot of these patterns need to be more fully checked. If anybody would like to write to me asking me for inconsistencies, I can probably, in a quieter moment, supply some.
Thank you. All right, so one more question.
Do we still have time for one? Do we still have time for one?
Yes.
So Seonga asks, says some countries such as South Korea,
Yes, they're decreasing, yes.
Actual values of well-being are decreasing over ages, unlike the U-shaped. What's your idea on it?
Yes, okay. First, we have to make sure we're comparing apples with apples. And generally, people who claim not to find a U-shape are looking at raw data. They're not controlling for other characteristics. And the claim that's been made is that adjusting for other characteristics leaves you with a U-shape. But beyond that, we know there are so-called cohort effects. Think of Eastern Europe. The old people there grew up in a very different regime than the young and so on. So to understand underlying characteristics, we need to average across different sorts of people and different kinds of countries.
That's great, Andrew. So I'm really happy to have had so many questions. It looks like there's still a few more, but I think it's time to get Carol set up. So we will we'll move on. Thank you very much for your talk, as well as a clearly provocative set of questions, and for taking so many of them too. Thank you.
Indeed.
And Carol, if you can share, now's the time to do so. Let's see how it works. And while we get you set up sharing, I can give you an introduction. All right, one moment. And you can go ahead and unmute yourself too.
Sorry, I was trying to share my screen. It seems to be the same problem as yesterday. I'll try one more time.
Okay, no problem. I can share as we need to. So while you do that, though, I'll go ahead and introduce you. So
Okay.
Many of you know who Carol Graham is. She is the Leo Paz-Volsky Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Sorry, 1 second. I'm going to ask Francesco, can you mute? Get an echo. Thanks. Okay, so Carol Graham is the Leo Paz-Volsky Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, a College Park professor at the University of Maryland, and a senior scientist at Gallup. She's another one of the leading contributors to the Economics of Happiness. Her work is particularly relevant to general audiences and policymakers. She's the author or editor of more than 10 books, the latest of which is entitled Happiness for All, Unequal Lives and Hopes in Pursuit of the American Dream. She has consulted for several multinational institutions, served on a U.S. National Academy of Sciences panel on well-being metrics, and testified in front of the U.S. Congress. She's also the current president of the International Society for Quality of Life Studies, which, as we mentioned earlier, is helping to support this set of webinars. Without further ado, Professor Graham, the floor is yours, but give me 1 second to share the presentation. So I
Thank you,
apologize.
Kelsey. We've tried several times to get this to work, but for some reason, I can't share my screen.
Yeah, and I know that it's a little bit different. Oh, apologize. I'm also need a second to get this going. Select. Every program is a little different. Excuse me. One second. And share application. There we go. Apologize for the delay. Everybody can see that, I think.
Can you put it in slideshow mode, Kelsey, or is that too difficult? If not, it doesn't matter.
So I have put it in full screen, and it's not showing that way for you guys.
Okay. Well,
Is it? No. Okay. One second. There's another.
It's okay this way. I wouldn't worry. I mean, it's perfectly legible.
Okay. All right. I will take you this direction. Okay. So the floor is yours. Sorry for the delay.
Now I don't see the slide, so.
Now.
Just, I think go back to where you were before. It was better than this, which is nothing.
Okay. You have it.
Okay,
now.
that's a lot better. Thank you.
Okay. Apologize.
No worries, no worries. Thanks very much for having me. And this is a great series. I wish this is the second year in a row we're supposed to be in Luxembourg, which is a little more exciting than on a screen, but we're hoping for next year, right?
Yes,
Francesco?
definitely.
And Kelsey. So this does very much complement Andrew's presentation. Maybe the next slide, please. So it's an example. I want to talk a little bit about measurement for those of you that don't know, that aren't that familiar with how we measure well-being and life satisfaction and despair, but mainly to show an example of how the metrics can not only answer scientific questions, but what they contribute on that domain is actually also really relevant to policy. And so before COVID, long before, I was using well-being metrics to look at inequality of outlooks and outcomes in the United States, even though most of my early work was on developing countries, and I'm originally from Peru, and did the first large-scale study, I think, of life satisfaction in developing countries, and showed that the correlates are very similar almost everywhere in the world, and that the U-shaped curve holds almost everywhere in the world as well, again, complementing what Andrew talked about. But that the U.S. in particular, although it's not alone, it is still, I think, the starkest example of increases in inequality, with, as you know, part of it being unique to the U.S. and its social structures, weak safety nets, and other things, but also having to do with what I mentioned in my question, which is kind of the divide that's come with skill-driven growth and technology-driven growth in the economy, and essentially the decline of the traditional working class in a lot of rich countries. So I've been looking at not only these trends, but also why they matter. So why do the increasingly unequal distributions of income, well-being, and hope matter? And I've been paying a lot of attention to hope and optimism recently, including in a paper with Kelsey. And why do these things matter to our future health and prosperity? And in multiple studies, I've found that hope is a channel to individuals' investments in their future. Basically, if people believe in their future, they're more likely to invest in their futures. They're less likely to risk their futures. Kelsey and I have a paper in JIBO, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, where we find that optimistic people live longer. And a channel to that longevity is that they make more investments in education. So my the research I'm going to talk about focuses on inequality and well-being, not just inequality in income, but in well-being, and the connection to deaths of despair in the United States, And one of the first findings that got me into this was finding that the gaps between the well-being of the poor and the rich are much greater in the US than they are in Latin America, which is quite surprising. The reason I even looked into that was coming back from trips abroad, my native Peru, but many, many other countries. And just sort of an intuitive question was, why does poverty seem so much more depressing in rich countries, and particularly in the United States, than in much poorer countries? So the other thing I found at the same time was that there are big and surprising differences across races in the United States in terms of their well-being and optimism. And one of the things I was going to ask Andrew, but I couldn't ask too many questions, was, his slides focused on whites. And if he had the trends for minorities, and particularly African Americans, there would have been some surprising differences, because we don't see those levels of despair in African Americans and in Hispanics in the United States, although here and there we do, but nothing like the big trends in despair for low-income whites. So, and then the other point is that related to all of this is that had we been tracking well-being over time, we would have found and noticed a drop in the well-being of less than college-educated white males in the late 1970s, along with the first wave of the manufacturing decline. And we might have woken up to something being wrong in this cohort until before we discovered deaths of despair 20 years later. So I think more, thinking in the policy direction and for statistics offices around the world, like StateTech, that we should be regularly tracking well-being. They're a way to take society's temperature, and if somebody is sick and has a fever, somebody being a particular cohort, a particular place, we can be warned about that before we have things like crises of premature mortality. And now with COVID, in societies around the world, we need tools to tell who's suffering the most, who's really at risk, who is most vulnerable, because obviously the pandemic has exposed deep vulnerabilities in a lot of different societies, and surely in the United States. Could we, next slide, please, Kelsey? So just quickly, for those of you that aren't familiar with happiness equations or well-being equations, very quickly, they're quite simple econometric equations. Here's an example: well-being of individual I at time t, and then you have x is the beta is a vector of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, and then the unobserved traits are captured in the error term. But unlike other in most econometric equations, you throw out the error term as noise, right? Noise in the data. But actually, because well-being equations only explain about 30% of an individual's well-being, what's in the error term is often unobservable character traits that actually can matter a lot to outcomes. We have an old paper from 2004, also in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, showing that people with higher levels of well-being, in this case, life satisfaction and hope for future mobility, we follow the same people over time, did better in both income and health arenas later in their lives. And we actually we captured that unobserved epsilon, their error term, and used that as an independent variable in the next stage regression with either income or health as an outcome variable. And then that has since been repeated multiple times in different ways with experiments. The work Kelsey and I have done, other lab experiments, twin studies that Andrew has done with Jean-Emmanuel Deneuve. But essentially, people with high levels of life satisfaction seem to do better in the future. Also, just as a Andrew was talking about the question of, life satisfaction and age with and without controls. Well, we tend to control for a whole lot of things that have consistent patterns with life satisfaction: income, which matters; age, which we've just heard about, and it indeed matters; health, employment, social relationships, marriage, all those things that seem to be fairly consistent correlates of life satisfaction around the world. And once we control for those, we can explore the happiness effects of things that vary or change more, such as inflation and unemployment, inequality, environmental quality, commuting, smoking, exercise, a whole lot of things. But the most important thing again, for those of you not familiar with well-being equations, is that we don't ask people if particular things like their age or their health status or their money make them happy. We are taking the well-being questions up front and then controlling for all these things. They have no idea that we're correlating their answers and putting them into an equation. So next slide, please. I keep trying to click on my slides and then I realize I'm not clicking on anything. So again, here's the famous U curve. This is data from Latin America. As I mentioned, we found this holds in most countries around the world, except for very poor or violent ones where it's obviously difficult to age. And also in countries with very low levels of life expectancy, people just don't get out of the U. Relevant to the US now, and also some of the findings that Andrew highlighted, it's in these middle-aged years that we're seeing these rises in reported pain, in despair, in deaths of despair, in opioid overdose, all sorts of things. That's unique to the U.S. Certainly, the overdose part of the story, or at least it's starker than in other countries. But again, even in studies that include European countries, we're also seeing sort of this midlife increase in despair. Next slide, please. So one of the things I noted, though, was that in the U.S. there are big differences in well-being, and this is data from 2015, before we even knew about deaths of despair. I found this right before Ann Case and Angus Deaton came out with their famous paper on deaths of despair. And I did this at the time of the Ferguson riots and the Baltimore riots, a time when the African-American community was under a lot of stress. There were a lot of protests, a lot of concern about African-American well-being. And yet, if you look at this slide, this is across poor cohorts, so poor whites, poor blacks, poor Asians, and poor whites here is the left out group. We find that poor blacks are almost 3 times as likely to be in a higher level on a future life satisfaction or optimism scale than poor whites. Hispanics are also more optimistic, but the gap isn't as big. And this was a surprising finding when I got it. I've since looked at everything from sociological data to historical data on African-American resilience, and there's a lot to it. And rather remarkably, it does not go away over time. It didn't go away with Trump's election, that optimism gap held. It hasn't even gone away during COVID, although there's some signs of stress and anxiety among African Americans. Their optimism levels have not changed, which is really remarkable. And there's a lot to it. It's a complex finding with any range of explanations, but it's also a relative finding. So it's relative to poor whites, and their despair is continuing to increase. So this is something that we'll see in the data. And the other thing about this optimism finding is this is not a Pollyanna finding. I have this term in the literature called happy peasants and frustrated achievers, but this is not a happy peasant finding, because if you ask the same poor Black respondents, are they satisfied with their financial situation? They'll say no, their financial situation is bad. Are they satisfied in the city where they live? They'll say no. They may say they want to make it better. They want to get back to their community. That's very much a part of the optimism story. But for sure, this is both a persistent finding and also one that that holds up to sort of reality checks in terms of, are they just being naive? And I think the answer is very much no. So next slide, please, Kelsey. So these are mortality rates in the United States, 1990 to 2015. It's a slide from Angus Deaton and Ann Case, or Ann Case and Angus Deaton. And thanks for fixing that. So as you can see, these are a set of rich countries, and the red line at the top that's going up is US whites, US non-Hispanic whites. This is pre-COVID, and at that time we were the only wealthy country in the world where mortality rates were going up rather than down. It's a pretty stark finding and a pretty big difference if you look at the graph. If you look at the middle of the chart at the thick blue line that says USH, that's US Hispanics, and as you can see, their rates or mortality rates are going down along with those of other rich countries. If we had African Americans on this side, they would be parallel to the US Hispanics. So Hispanics and African Americans started off at lower levels of life expectancy than whites, but they've been continuing to make gradual progress, versus if you see US whites, they're going in the opposite direction. So obviously there's something very, very wrong with this cohort. Next slide, please. So the next thing we did was try and see if we could match our metrics of ill-being and well-being with the trends in mortality. Again, with my interest in seeing if our well-being metrics could be vulnerability indicators, if it could be a robust way of taking society's temperature, so to speak, and prevent things like this, or at least warn of trends like this. So we did this with the CDC composite death rate for 35 to 64-year-olds for alcohol poisoning and other alcohol deaths, drug overdoses and other drug deaths and suicides, and also unexplained accidental deaths, at the county level data, and then with very detailed data on the US from Gallup, the Gallup Daily Poll, which interviewed 1,000 Americans a day from 2008 through 2019. And we focus most on hope or optimism on the one hand and stress and worry on the other. And we found indeed that, that these metrics track very closely at the individual level, at the level of place, and at the level of race. So they basically, the metrics trended with deaths of despair for individuals, for places where there are high levels of deaths of despair, and the measures across race conform those mortality trends that you see. We also looked at some of the things that were unique to places, like their health behaviors, their cultural makeup, their racial makeup. So we found, for example, that places with higher levels of well-being had lower deaths of despair, had healthier behaviors across the board, less smoking, more exercise, for example, and also that racial diversity as a characteristic of place mattered as well, because there are less deaths of despair among minorities. It shows up in the place-based analysis, and places with that are more diverse have less deaths of despair. This also correlates with economic vibrancy. So it's the homogeneously white blue-collar communities in the heartland, in suburbs around the country, that have been hit the most by the manufacturing decline, and that have been basically just declining. People who can leave have left, and people who are left are in despair. It's a pretty vicious circle. These predominantly blue-collar white communities also have a high concentration of prime-age males out of the labor force, and high levels of opioid addiction. So of prime-age males out of the labor force, for example, white prime-age males out of the labor force, so that's, essentially between 25 and 54 who have dropped out of labor force permanently, they not only have high levels of opioid addiction, but they also have high levels of reported pain, very bad health indicators, high levels of smoking, and absolutely very, very low on any of the indicators for eudaimonia, like purpose and meaning in life, low indicators on wanting to get back to the community. They're a very toxic group, and unfortunately also they are disproportionately represented in deaths of despair and among Trump voters. And if you look at the makeup of the cohorts that stormed the Capitol on January 6th, there were a lot of out of labor force prime-age white males as well. I mean, that's anecdotal because it's a small sample of people, but it fits with broader patterns in the data. And then the latest research we've been doing is the sort of the idea of twin health public health crises, and we've been adding in COVID deaths at the level of county in the U.S. and looking at where both COVID deaths and deaths of despair coincide. So when we started this, the patterns were very different because COVID hit the cities first. It hit minorities, African Americans and Hispanics the hardest, and it blew through cities very quickly because of population density. But then when it went to rural areas, you had a whole different composition of events, because you had rural places with terrible health care, the nearest hospital being 2 hours away, again, a concentration of people with already high levels of despair. and then you put the COVID shock into that, and the outcome has not been, the outcome's been pretty depressing. And we've had to switch gears in terms of data because there's a little Gallup panel for the COVID year, but it's not a great sample. We've now been using data from the Census Pulse survey, which also has its flaws, but at least it's bigger. And because the CDC data comes out 2 years after the fact, we've also had to switch to first responder data. So we're looking at responses to calls for suicide, mental health reports, overdoses, again, around the country, and pairing that with the well-being data. And we built an interactive indicator, a vulnerability indicator, where users can look at these patterns themselves at the level of state and county. The link to it's at the bottom in case you're interested. But so the whole idea is now we're trying to get to a place where we could eventually have an official indicator of this sort, where actually it was not me and my PhD students tracking this, but it was actually one of the agencies in the government and producing reliable and consistent national, publicly available national data in the way that many other countries do. Obviously the UK does, but also New Zealand and many others. Canada's, I think, about to launch such an effort, at least to the extent I've been involved in that. So can we go to the next slide? Very quick, we'll go through this quickly because I've sort of said most of this. But again, it's their economic cost to despair. So if you think about the out of labor force population in the United States, prior to COVID, 20%, 20% of prime age males had dropped out of the labor force permanently. That's obviously not good for economic productivity. Again, these people have high levels of despair. They're not going to take a job if it's across the street from them. They've just literally dropped out of any kind of purposeful existence. And they're likely to live in counties with high levels of deaths of despair and to not be economically vibrant. They're also much more likely to live in their parents' homes or in their parents' census tracts than any other labor market group. And they have very limited skills and high levels of opioid dependence. So they're not moving to opportunity. A lot of our economic recovery efforts in the US focus on moving to opportunity, trying to give people incentives to move to places where there are jobs, even within their region. We're not asking, the programs don't aim to get people to move from Appalachia to San Francisco, but they're pockets of opportunity, identify those and give people incentive to move to those near where they are. But these people don't move. They're still living in their parents' homes at age 50. So we also have sort of linked these findings to our low or falling levels of geographic mobility. So people in the US are much less likely to move to other places to find jobs than they were 20 years ago. So it's sort of another manifestation of despair and its implications for productivity and for the labor force. And next slide. Thanks, Kelsey. There's very much a place-based story to this. So this is mortality for whites age 45 to 54 years old. The dark places are with higher levels of mortality. We have a whole series of maps, too many to show you, but if we were to superimpose a map of reliance on disability insurance, a map of overdoses, a map of suicide rates, a map for Trump voting, a map for cognitive skill deserts, they almost line up perfectly. So what we're seeing is really almost two different countries, a desperate, sort of angry, but poor health, frustrated, falling behind cohort, a large population cohort, and then the coasts, which are racially diverse, much more vibrant economically, a lot of high tech skill investments. So we're really seeing two different countries. And if having lived through the Trump years here, sometimes you feel they're at war with each other. And then comes COVID, of course. So next slide, please, Kelsey. And here we go. This is based on this first responder data. And this is essentially the last 2 weeks of 2018-19 and 2017-2018 compared to the last 2 weeks of 2019 and the rest of 2020. And as you can see, this is opioid overdose. Overdose is almost double. If we were to superimpose, or if I showed you the slide we have for mental and behavioral health reports, they also rise almost double. The one thing that's different is suicide. And that actually spiked in the early part of 2020 and then dropped down. And we're not sure why. I think one problem with this is if you're looking at first responder data for overdoses and then overdose deaths, but you don't know how many overdose deaths are suicide or non-intentional. We don't know that. So you have a slight drop in suicide, but a very large increase in opioid overdoses, and some of that confounds those two sets of data. Either way, the trends are really not pretty. So our estimates of we had what we call the excess deaths of despair due to the COVID economic and mental health shock. So these aren't COVID deaths; these are excess deaths of this kind. We were at about 70,000 people a year dying of deaths of despair, and the estimates are about 50 to 60,000 more deaths of these kind in 2020. And we're seeing that this kind of mental health spillover is if anything, sort of getting worse rather than better right away, even though there is some sort of economic recovery. The COVID shock hit the already vulnerable the worst, and so they are in worse shape. And it's becoming kind of almost a national level crisis of despair. I've been doing some work with people in the federal agencies on this, if anybody wants to know more about it. It's sad, but the one thing it might do is finally get the US to take well-being metrics and research seriously, and that does seem to be happening. So next slide. Oh, that was the I didn't realize I had this one. Well, I already talked about it. Can we go on to the next ones? Thank you. So here, this is during COVID, and this is just to heighten the African American versus whites differences in optimism. So again, these are low income groups, and we've got optimism on the left panel and stress on the right. And as you can see, the blue line, low income Blacks are much more optimistic and report much lower levels of stress throughout the COVID pandemic. That's May 2020 to February 2021. This is from data from a survey that we did with WashU in St. Louis, a nationally representative survey. And we even find that low-income Blacks are more optimistic. Even those who lost their jobs during COVID are more optimistic than low-income whites. Hispanics move around a little more. There were, as I mentioned, increases in Black anxiety during COVID, but that a lot of that was during the George Floyd protests. But you see the anxiety increases coexisting with these persistent high levels of optimism. Again, something I think I'd like to know more about and what explains it, and can people learn it, because it is it's a big question. But I think understanding how people are resilient and how difficult they are. I just saw Andrew's question, and I don't know. I think some of it's biological. Some of it's historical. He's asking why are African Americans more optimistic than whites. I think some of it is decades of having to cope and learn coping and resilience skills, because they always knew the system was stacked against them, and they had to build, community support, informal ties, family ties, what I call communities of empathy, versus the narrative for poor whites was very much the American dream. You work hard, you get ahead, and the people who fall behind and are poor are those losers. They're those immigrants and those minorities. And all of a sudden, when poor whites are falling behind, they don't have another narrative, right? They don't have another story. They don't have a history of having to, having the system fail them. They had a history of having the system essentially give them some privilege. And they worked hard, and they had meaningful, respected jobs, and all of that's gone. And I think Hispanics are quite similar to African Americans in that dimension. I mean, I'm from Peru, and I know everybody's your aunt or uncle, whether or not you're related to them, really doesn't matter. But there are these extended families that serve as huge community support And again, Hispanics have also had to fight discrimination, the challenges of immigration and integrating, and they're again more optimistic than whites. Although the gap with African Americans is really the remarkable research question, I think. So here's some research I'm doing trying to understand this a little better. Can we switch slides, Kelsey? So these are a survey that I've been doing of hope among older adolescents, 18 to 19 years old. We started them in Peru, and in a peri-urban neighborhood that used to be really poor. You know, dirt streets, no running water, no sort of tapping in illegally to electricity. It's improved over time. I've been working there about 2 decades, and now there's some of it's paved. There's a health clinic there. There's a metro a 10-minute walk away. So the older part of the neighborhood is now what you might call emerging poverty, out of poverty, poor middle class. And the up in the hills, it's still sand hills and prefab houses and no, buying water from trucks. And we looked at the hopes and aspirations of these kids for future education was our main interest, their educational aspirations, with the idea again that people with hope are much more likely to invest in their futures and avoid risky behaviors, and that this channel is particularly important for people who are relatively deprived because they don't have assets to leverage against their futures. So hope plays a big role in continuing. Also turns out so does having a mentor or some sort of community support. And we got 85% of these kids. And if you saw this neighborhood, it would be hard to believe this, but if you know Peru, you would believe it. 85% of our kids said they wanted to go to college or graduate school. And when we asked them if they would be able to do that, they said yes. And we went back 3 years later, and we found out indeed our high aspirations kids are almost all on track. Some got sick, some moved away for family reasons or to work abroad. But for the most part, the high aspirations kids still have high aspirations, and they're on track to achieve. They're on track to where they said they would be. We found that with individual fixed effects, that the aspirations are very stable over time. They're also positively associated with personality traits such as self-efficacy and life satisfaction. And we also found that they were much less likely, the high aspirations kids, to engage in any risky behaviors like drug use or unsafe sex. I mean, they all smoked and drank as 18 and 19-year-olds or whatever. And that family or community support, one or the other, it didn't have to be both, really mattered to their belief in education. So they need some sort of mentorship. So then I did these surveys. Next slide, please, Kelsey, and then I can wrap up. When I got these results, I said, if you did this survey among poor whites in the US, you would never get 85% of kids wanting to go to college or grad school. And indeed, I was right. So now I'm doing these surveys in low-income neighborhoods in Missouri, outside St. Louis, for Black and white adolescents. One is a Black school superintendency district, and the other is a low-income white one. We've got about 200 plus adolescents. They're either high school seniors or just graduated the year before, 18 and over. We were going to do these surveys in person, like in Peru, but because of COVID, we had to do mail-in surveys. So that is obviously not optimal, but we're getting the responses now. One quite remarkable pre-survey data was conditional on graduating from high school, which is more difficult in the Black district. A 55% graduation rate versus a 90% graduation rate in the white district. Conditional on graduating, the African American students were much more likely to pursue higher education and to have stronger belief in the value of higher education, which is also true for Hispanics. That's confirmed by the head of historically Black colleges and universities. So the first batch of results from the white kids, they really mirror these larger data trends I'm talking about. Only one of the first batch of respondents of whites, who was the daughter of a single mother medical assistant with some college, aspired to go to college. all of the other white kids only aspired to finish high school or maybe 1 year of technical school. Lack of skills and money were common reasons for not pursuing more education. But the other very clear factor was that almost none of them have college educated parents, and almost none of the parents aspire for their kids to do more than graduate high school, and some actively did not want them to pursue more education, which is a really depressing trend. But it also explains, it's very associated with poor white despair and not having a narrative for the future. They all said they lacked the skills and finances to move to a better place, and they all had average to lower levels of hope for the future, and low, in addition to low education aspirations. Some were happy, some weren't. And in contrast, the Black respondents, who were more deprived materially, have much higher hope for the future. They had higher education aspirations. Almost all of them wanted to go to college or grad school. Their parents are not that educated. The mothers were more likely to have some college than the fathers, and also to be present. Yet in almost every case, at least one parent of the Black kids was pushing or supporting them in pursuing college or more education. The Black kids also had broader social and family networks than the white kids. Again, when I tried to explain the finding to Andrew's, in response to Andrew's question, this shows up even in these surveys of the kids. And I think it really reflects a history of knowing that the system isn't going to work for you, and the only way it's going to work is if you get educated and essentially get beyond, or as much as you can, get beyond a system that's kind of been stacked against you for a long time. But the really depressing part of this, I think, is the white kids, because they're very likely to end up in despair. They're going to be the next generation in despair. And then just the last slide. So just to, I'm not going to go through the slide, but it is, the key question here is, can we learn from resilient minorities? You know, we can start by trying to understand this resilience. And there are some of the well-being interventions from places like What Works Wellbeing, and others suggest that some of these interventions work in at least reducing isolation and despair. But how can hope be learned? I don't know. I mean, that's something I'm thinking a lot about, and thinking about pushing this research design to see if we can answer that question. But it's very difficult to do. But at least we know that hope does lead to better outcomes. We know that mentorship is a key channel. That second part of it is a replicable thing. It doesn't need to be, the mentor doesn't need to be in the kid's family. So that's something. But can we cross the deep racial divides in this country? Are lessons from African American communities going to work among homogeneously white blue collar communities? I don't know, but that's a big question, and I'm trying to learn more about it. And then back to the US thing, I think because people are essentially really worried about the state of mental health in this country, we really do have an opportunity to get these statistics into our system in a serious way. It's starting to happen. It's not, nobody's following, all the agencies are doing everything separately and not following best practice, but I think that's something we can address going forward, and hopefully end up in a better place in terms of having, taking well-being seriously as a society, but mainly also having the metrics in our statistics so that we can track our social well-being and our social ill-being. So thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Very provocative, interesting. I wasn't quite sure what everybody could see on my screen, so I couldn't see the Q&A, and because I just tried to stay in.
I saw things pop up, or maybe it was in the chat. I saw a couple of questions pop up.
We have some questions.
Yes, Francesco just confirmed that we have some, so let me stop sharing, and we will start bringing them up. And Francesco, if you want to share again. And he will start first with the question.
Well, while the screen is loading, thank you, Carol, for your presentation. And I will go ahead with the second question, as the first one It was by Andrew. And there are basically two related questions, one by Lorna and one by Lia Rodriguez de la Vega. Basically, they asked if you have more information about relational networks. Lorna says, are the relational support networks of poor whites worse than those of others? And Lia Rodriguez de la Vega asks, well, if you have studied those support networks.
So I can't claim to have done any kind of fancy network analysis. Sort of been more involved in trying to understand the different trends, but I have done a bit of poking around, and part of it is this sort of, there's a very communal, both low-income Hispanics and low-income Blacks have kind of very strong communal ties. Even in our work on prime age males out of the labor force, we found that Black prime age males out of the labor force were much more likely to want to give back to their communities, to make their communities better than either white or Hispanic ones. We know that churches play a role. Baptist churches for Blacks are very much, it's very much a communal church. Also Hispanics and Catholic churches. Churches are often a way to socialize as much as anything else. An interesting question that Ann Case actually came up with when we were discussing this, but I don't have the data to answer it, is that low-income whites are more likely to be evangelicals, and evangelicals, in addition to having really corrupt, horrible leaders like Jerry Falwell, it's a religion that emphasizes the individual's relationship with God and not the community in the same way that, say, Baptist churches emphasize. So the church that doesn't seem to be a religion that emphasizes the communal ties and the strength of community support the way other churches do. We've done a study just looking at place and optimism across minorities and whites around the United States. And it's just a little simple map, but we found that the highest pockets of optimism for white Blacks and Hispanics were places where there were big concentrations of Blacks and Hispanics. So we were controlling for other things like health status, education, and everything else, but controlling for those things, it was very clear that African Americans in the South, that living in the South has, because of the strong African American culture and music and food, just very, very strong and deep cultural ties, there is something protective of mental health, even though we know objective indicators for Blacks in the South are terrible. But there is some, and we found also, another study found that there's been an increase in minority teen suicide or youth suicide between 16 and 24, but the living in the South mitigated that trend for Blacks. So there were many, many fewer Black suicides in the South than, say, in the Northeast, where there's less of a concentration of African American culture. For Hispanics, it was the Southwest of the country, where there are tons of Hispanic communities. There's a big concentration of Hispanics. So some of it is indeed cultural, but I haven't studied this in any robust sort of econometric way because I don't have good data.
Next question is from Michelle Schmidt. I think you can see it, but I'll read it out for everyone.
Yeah, I can see it.
Do you have it? Yeah. Do you have any explanation for why poor white parents would not encourage or even actively discourage their children to go to further in education than graduation from high school? Well, it seems to be totally the opposite case in African American families, even with parents who don't have higher education themselves.
It's pretty remarkable, and I had seen these trends in the data, and nothing struck me as much as when I read the handwritten responses of the kids in my surveys, because they would really say, no, I don't really get along with my parents. They don't support it, their education, or even those that did get along with their parents. And I think what's happened, and this is a very sad ideological division in the US, is that the deep skepticism of elites and the coasts among blue-collar whites, and which was made worse by Trump and his language, and many other things, and his false promises, and his racism. But there's a skepticism of the coast. There's a skepticism of science. These same people won't wear masks, which is absurd. So there's a whole kind of distrust in science. So if you're skeptical of these elites on the coast that go to college, you don't want your kids to do that. I mean, it's hard to achieve anyway. I mean, the costs of education in the U.S. are ridiculous, but I think there's now a strong ideological component to this, which is really counterproductive. It's much stronger among whites than minorities. I think there's still this strong sense for minorities that education is the only way to get out of where they are, the spot they're in for poor minorities. But I didn't expect that almost every response from the poor white kids would have this in it. It really surprised me.
Yes, thank you very much, Carol. That's really makes me think this answer. In the meanwhile, Dan Hebron kind of I'll get back to this issue of trying to explain this heterogeneity. He asks if you have thoughts on how much black-white cultural differences might affect comparability of self-reported well-being. For instance, historic racism might breed resilience as revealed in optimism, aspiration, etc., but also might cause reported well-being to overstate actual well-being relative to whites. And he provides some evidence from Gallup data from St. Louis showing this difference.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Dan, and thanks for being on. So one of that's one of the things when I said these weren't happy peasants and frustrated achievers, in the sense that it is people with distressed places, and there may be a little bit of lack of knowledge, and certainly the black-white optimistic gap at the higher levels of income exists, but it's not as big as across the low-income groups. But we did test for this in the sense that, we asked about city satisfaction. We controlled for religion to make sure religion wasn't driving this. And the same respondents were not optimistic about the state of their cities. They were quite critical about their financial situation. And that's something actually Andrew and Danny Blanchflower did in their review of my book. They also tested some financial indicators and how blacks reported those to, I think, try and get to the same question. Is it just naive optimism? There may be a little bit of naive optimism. There may be a sort of cultural cheerfulness. Like if you look at why Latin America scores higher than other regions of comparable income around the world, some of it is a cultural cheerfulness, the way Latin Americans answer the smiling yesterday questions. But if you go to Latin America, they tend to smile a lot more than they do, walking down the streets of St. Louis. So there's probably a bit of this at play, but it's just not. I don't think it's big enough to sort of diminish that gap.
I have actually a personal question. Can I ask?
Yeah.
I was trying to write it down, but didn't finish. So there are two interesting aspects that I kind of see in your story. The first one is, as I was typing, that optimism is not just a personal matter, but there is at least a socioeconomic component to it that can be object of policies, of public policies. I wonder what kind of public policies this may be. For instance, redistributive policies, welfare state policies. I'm thinking about high quality education for all. And so what do you think about this? And the second related question that I had is that it seems to me that what really is a discriminant is access to networks of relations that ultimately constitute sources of joint strength, of cooperation, ability to cooperate. So I wonder, and that's really actually my bias. I do not know America that well, and as your study is largely American-based, I would like to ask your opinion. Is there a reason why we should expect that American white have less access to these cooperation networks than Black people?
Yeah, so those are great questions, and they're obviously related. I think, I mean, when I think about the kind of personality trait versus environment kinds of explanations for well-being, I think they're very intertwined, right? And there is a natural distribution of personality traits, and there's also some genetic stuff that shows that. There's some work by Jean-Emmanuel Deneuve that shows that of U.S. racial groups, there's a gene transmitter called HTLLR that transmits higher levels of serotonin, and guess which racial group in the U.S. has the highest levels? African Americans. And we know that genes, develop over time, given the kinds of experiences that people have across their life cycles and then across intergenerational cycles. So there's some sort of cultural, biological components to this that are very difficult to disentangle, but I think are very clearly there. But yeah, there's also a socioeconomic kind of, if not caring how you do in the future is pretty equivalent to despair, right? I mean, if you have no sense of agency over your own life and no hopes not only for your future but your children's future, that's not a great mental state to be in. So yeah, and for minorities who've been discriminated against, I think that's how you get over that. How you defeat injustice is essentially being resilient and optimistic. So I think that's, it's what struck for low income whites. I think it's the tradition was that if you graduated high school and you were white, you were able to you had privileged access to the stable, good blue collar jobs, and you had a respected middle class or lower middle class life. And your network was essentially the Ozzie and Harriet family, two husband and wife, 2 kids. The families fell apart with the jobs going away, right? And there wasn't another narrative. So really interesting, and I think it also helps answer the network story. So Andrew Churlin, who's a really brilliant sociologist at Johns Hopkins, in the National Academy of Sciences and all kinds of stuff, but he did a study of the children of the steel workers at the Sparrows Point at Bethlehem Steel Mills in Baltimore, which is huge steel mills that were there forever till they declined about 20 years ago or were shut down. And the whites always had privileged access to the better jobs, to promotions, even after civil rights. There were always ways to get around. There was just implicit discrimination. The Black workers were brought up from North Carolina to work in the mills in a particular program. They didn't want to hire the Baltimore Blacks because they had too tough an attitude, right? So they brought up Blacks from North Carolina. They lived in segregated housing. They had, they were discriminated against in terms of promotions. But he studied the children of these 2 groups. So the white steelworkers' children still live in Dundalk, which is the surrounding neighborhood to the steel mill. None of them went to college, or very few of them. They're not radical, white supremacists, but they're kind of disgruntled. A lot of them drive Ubers. They don't really like it that there's Section 8 housing and immigrants in the neighborhood now. They basically haven't gone anywhere. The children of the Black steelworkers almost universally went to college. This is like my survey results, right? They all live in Towson and North Baltimore, nice sections of Baltimore, and have done very well. But here's the network story. They come back every Sunday and go to church in the neighborhood where The Wired was filmed. The Wired is a show about horrific Baltimore discrimination and racism and everything else. So they've gotten ahead, they've gone to college, but they still have these strong networks and this strong culture of wanting to give back to their community. And I think that is very much a part of optimism, and optimism being transferred from generation to generation. And in Peru, as poor and messed up as it is, although until COVID they had done better, there's a very strong belief in education. And that, I think that goes from, again, the Peruvian kids I surveyed, all of whom wanted to go to, or most of whom wanted to go to college or graduate school. None of their parents had college education, but they wanted their kids to. So, I mean, I guess you could say what's going on with low-income whites. And as for the personality traits, genetics, I don't know. There's some historical studies of poor whites, and it's quite, I would say it's controversial. It's a historian at Yale who wrote a story called White Trash, 400 Years, The Untold History of 400 Years of Class in America. And it was about poor whites and how they've been discriminated against, but also after, at the time of when slavery ended, that the plantation owners were much more likely to want to hire Black workers rather than poor white workers because they were more resilient. So it's a very complicated story. It's easy to step on somebody's toes when you're sort of researching into this stuff and trying to sort it out. But I think so yeah, I don't know. And then I'm looking at Kelsey's question. What's interesting, I'm not a fan of universal basic income for a number of reasons, because I think a lot of rich people would get it and not work. But but I am in favor of a much stronger safety net than we have in the United States. We have a terrible safety net that stigmatizes people. They have better safety nets in Latin America. I mean, conditional cash transfer programs that don't stigmatize people, and they give poor people cash as long as they send their kid to school and take them to the health post. I mean, it's pretty intuitive, and it's not, I mean, they're not perfect, but compared to the system we have, which is really, and our system is also all the earned income tax credit is a federal program. It's non-stigmatizing. It's great if you have a job, but if you don't have a job and you're getting TANF, the sort of cash transfers for the needy who don't or can't work or aren't working. Those are at the state level. The bureaucracies are horrible and stigmatizing. And you can bet where TANF has been dropping the most in the past 10 years in Republican states in the Deep South. So our safety net programs are terrible. And I think the conundrum for low-income whites who've always been against, they don't believe in the government, they don't believe in welfare because welfare was for those loser minorities and loser immigrants. That was the narrative, right? And now if they need help, they're just kind of lost. And again, the nature of the safety net programs don't help at all. What we do see a lot of reliance on among prime age males and women out of the labor force, but mainly the men, is disability insurance, which is actually the one, once you're on it, there are no incentives to get off it. It's very difficult because you can't look for a job and stay on it. But secondly, disability insurance also gives people health care. So if you have gone out of the labor force and you have disability insurance, you have no incentives to get off it, because who wants to lose their health insurance? And if you have a family, but it's all, yeah. So I mean, I think you're right, Francesca. The sort of the state of our safety net, which is very fragmented and full of disincentives and full of stigma, adds to the problem in a big way.
Thank you, Carol, for your question and for putting together mine and Kelsey's question. I know we basically are out of time, but allow, if you can, just one last question by Johannes
Sure.
Sirata. who asks, would you think that the data are consistent with the hypothesis that well-being and despair, and perhaps optimism, depend on the perceived time trend of how fairly one is being treated by society?
That's a good question. It's a big one, and I don't have a scientific answer to it or a data-driven answer to it. Some anecdotal data surely suggests that some of the sentiment of these of the poor low-income whites in despair are very much that these same coastal elites that they mistrust forgot about them totally, right? That they were left behind, and some of this unfortunately is intertwined with racism, but that they were just left behind, and the Obama government was only, and the Clinton government, whatever, was focusing on poor minorities and not their plight, and the decline of manufacturing. And that's an attitude that's easy to then sort of to almost exploit it, which is what Trump did, right? To make America great again, which was like make America white again, and a lot of false promises that were never going to work, like bring back steel, and we're going to bring back whatever else it was. It was about trying to make low-income whites feel that they were the focus of the government, even though in the end they did nothing for them. But that and and the way it was done also heightened racial divides as well. But I think that it's also a little bit like Kahneman's prospect theory, right? People value losses disproportionately to gains, and so even though it's a very complicated social dynamic, because you have whites who were previously privileged for decades, but really aren't anymore. I mean, they don't face the same kind of police discrimination that African Americans do, but you could hardly call them privileged now. But they were for a long time, and so justifiably, people focused on injustice, racial injustice, and and that still exists. So how you deal with these two sets of perceptions among big racial cohorts in our society is really complicated. I don't have the answer, which is not a great way to end a seminar. At least to that question, I don't have an answer.
I think it's a great way to end, because it means that we need to have more seminars, and there's more research to be done. I want to thank you on behalf of StatTech, both Carol, you, and also Andrew, very much for giving us these wonderful presentations, very provocative set of discussions, and also our attendees for contributing. So thank you again. And one more reminder, we have 2 more talks tomorrow. You can see here on the slide, Ruth Veenhoven and John de Graaf, which should also provide for an interesting set of ideas and discussion. So thank you again, everyone.
Well, thank you guys for the nice invitation and the great group and questions.
Great.
Thank you so much. Hope to see you soon in person.
Yeah, in Luxembourg.
Yes, yes. Assuming all goes well, it will be back on next year in person.
That would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I will go ahead and close the session now. Thank you.